everyone, and welcome to Rainbow Space Magic. We're just going to wait a minute or two while people join the webinar from the waiting room. While we're waiting, if you'd like, you can, say hello in the chat. Thank you, Tucker, for starting us off with that. So you can say hello, you can tell people where you are, and we're just going to wait a minute or so to get things started. Okay, so why don't we get going? Welcome to Rainbow Space Magic. This is our 5th iteration, and I cannot believe that we have been doing this since June 2020. Thank you all of you for joining us. We obviously couldn't do this without you, so we're really thrilled to have you join us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. My name is Monique. My pronouns are she, her. And I live on the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe in what is now referred to as Ottawa, Canada at the moment. I have been part of the RSM team since the beginning, and I'm really happy to have you here. This morning we are here for the first of 2 panels on editing that we're a bit of a mini track, one today, one tomorrow. This morning's is called What Authors Should Know About Working with an Editor. This and the other editing panel have been pre-recorded, but we will be having a live Q&A afterwards, so stick around for that. We welcome you to use the chat to talk to each other and share recommendations and such in a respectful manner. If you would like to submit a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function that you should be able to see there at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. So there'll be time for questions closer to the end, but you can add those questions to the Q&A function as you go. And after the panel, we can continue this conversation in the Discord channel specifically for this panel. I think that's about it. So why don't we get going? As I said, this panel was pre-recorded, so I'm going to play the recording and then we will turn it over to our panelists who are here with us as well. Okay, so let's go.
Okay, I'm Tanya. My pronouns are they, them. I edit, I translate, and teach editing and writing in a bunch of places. I help authors make their stories and their prose even stronger. And some of my favorite things to work on are science fiction, fantasy, horror, retellings, queer stories, experimental narratives. I'm also really into interactive fiction and graphic novels. Genevieve, what about you?
I'm Genevieve. I am an editor, a writer, and a writing coach. I mostly work on speculative fiction, so fantasy and horror being among my favorites because of the magic and the mayhem. Yeah, that's it. Davy, what's up with you?
Hi everyone. I'm Davy Kent. I'm an editor based in Vancouver, British Columbia. I got my start with copy editing, and I focus primarily on speculative fiction as well as romance. And in the past couple of years, I've also added developmental editing to my services with a focus on world building, which is really my bread and butter, which I believe is quite similar to Andy's story.
Yep, so I'm Andy. My pronouns are he and they. I live in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I work as a book editor, writer, and a book coach. And I love speculative fiction, especially fantasy fiction with interesting and creative world building. And that links to my previous career in cultural anthropology. So I love any crossover there, linked, like anything that links to folklore, mythical creatures, and cultural considerations in fiction.
I love all of the speculative fiction that we are all very much into, and like hearing everybody's different approaches to it. Before we start, let's briefly cover what editing services can look like and some of the common terms that we use. Tanya, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So I like to think of editing as broadly divided into 2 categories: the big picture stuff, the story, and then the language, the prose. Andy and I are going to talk a little bit about what types of services fall within within the story side of things, and then Genevieve and Davy are going to cover the prose. I think of story divided into three main categories: coaching, which isn't strictly an editing service, but a lot of editors also offer that. Critiques, so like a written report of the general overview of the story and areas for improvement, what's being done well, and developmental editing, which is basically like critique with comments in the manuscript with like basically a little bit more hand holding. Is that how you define them as well, Andy?
Yeah, basically. So for me, coaching is feedback on a work in progress, and it might be written feedback. Like I might give you feedback on a chapter, or it could be like a one-on-one, or well, some people do group coaching as well, where you're discussing your work in progress on a call or in a Zoom meeting, something like that. And like coaching can be really specific. For instance, I've worked with coaches where we've discussed like gender world building in my novel for an hour and tried to get some more clarity on that. So it can be really specific, or it could be a really general, like, I don't know what to do next. Can you help me?
Yeah, there's
So-
I feel like there's also like the generative side of coaching where you're stuck in the process of writing, and then there's also revision coaching, which is what I do more of, where it's like, here I have this novel, I'm stuck, but I don't necessarily want an editor quite yet. Yeah, and Genevieve does a lot of group coaching as well. And I know this isn't your section to talk on, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that kind of thing works.
Yeah, I think group coaching really does address that. I'm stuck in the process, or I'm feeling very like isolated in my journey, and I just like want that community. But I don't necessarily want somebody looking over my shoulder and seeing what I've written yet. So in the group coaching sessions, it's a lot of just discussing where we're at and what problems we're encountering, and then making sure that we're keeping everyone accountable. So if you said you're going to write, 5,000 words between now and the next meeting, you have somebody there who's like, did you write those 5,000 words? So just to kind of keep that momentum going and not feel isolated in it. But it is typically big picture that people are working on, and just getting the story out, right? Getting it out of your head and onto the page.
I just wanted to say something about critique and developmental editing. Like again, like editors define these terms differently. There's no one way of doing it. For me, critique's more about diagnosing problems, and developmental editing, which is a longer process with multiple redos of a manuscript, is about not just diagnosing problems, but proposing like cures or whatever, new visions for the manuscript. I'm sure there's some overlap between those in every project, but that's one of the distinctions that I make when I'm working on.
That's interesting. It's completely different from how I do it. For me, it's also it's just like a developmental edit, almost exactly, except there's no manuscript comments. So yeah, it just goes to show that we all use these terms differently, and there isn't necessarily a standard way. Yeah.
I'm the same as Tanya in that mostly a manuscript critique is just a report, and I will point out, specific things and give examples from the text, but you don't then get the manuscript pages back with comments in them. The manuscript is, it is what it is, and it stays on its own unless I'm doing a developmental edit, and then I'm going in and pointing out specific instances that I've raised in the report. And I will also say that I actually call it substantive editing, not developmental editing. So the terminology that every editor uses is also different. So make sure that you are checking their website and reading their description, because they could be calling the same service something completely different, or it could be completely different services. And the only way to know is to read through an editor's website. On the prose level, we've got sort of workshopping, line or stylistic editing, another one of those services that it's often the same service, and every editor will have a different, whether they call it a line edit or a stylistic edit. And we also have copy editing and proofing. Most of my work when I'm doing this kind of prose, when I'm addressing the prose, is at the workshopping or stylistic editing side of things. And that's really all about readability and flow and getting those details right and strengthening the authorial voice. So I'm really going into your manuscript and pointing out sentences that could be strengthened. Working with speculative fiction, there's a lot of speculative fiction writers I find who overwrite, and then, a lot of the stylistic editing is cutting it down, and, you said the same thing 3 times. Let's merge these 3 sentences into one really strong sentence. So that's on the stylistic line editing kind of side. When it's workshopping, there's a little bit more back and forth. Stylistic edit, for me, I'm just going to go through and make all these comments and suggest all these changes. I do write up a short report so you know why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I don't have to have too many explanations in the manuscript. But workshopping is a little bit more interactive between us. There's a little bit more back and forth of, I've made some comments and now it goes back to the author for their input and then comes back to me, and there can be a bit more interaction in that regard. Davy, I know you do more, I'm not sure actually how much stylistic editing you do, but I know you do copy editing. So do you want to speak to those?
Yes, so I primarily do copy editing. There's sort of a blurred line between copy editing and line editing. Like a lot of the times when you're copy editing, you still like notice like, oh, you've repeated this several times. You might want to reduce that. But when I'm copy editing, I don't tend to make those changes myself. I recommend it to the author, but it's still up to them if they want to do that. So with copy editing, the editor focuses on the grammar, the syntax, the punctuation. They focus on making sure that everything in your manuscript is consistent and that it fits the vision that you have for your manuscript. A really good point for this is that it's not as simple as just grammar. Like you might have an English degree or something like that, and you'll have learned all the mechanics of grammar, and that might not be the right fit for your manuscript. There's a lot of nuance that goes into how you write a story, and that's the responsibility of a copy editor to make sure that how you've written your story represents the vision that you have. And it's their job to make sure that everything is consistent, that it fits the vision, and that you're not making consistency mistakes. Like if a character has blonde hair in one scene and they're brunette in the next scene, that's a problem, and it's their job to figure that out and to fix that for you. And then lastly, there's the proofing stage, which there are differences in how authors see this now. With trade publishing, proofreading is a very specific stage that comes at the very end, especially after it's been designed and formatted. With self-publishing, typically a lot of authors see that as just like copy editing, except not as extensive. So it's really important to speak with an editor and figure out if you agree on that definition, because there's a pretty good chance that your editor will see proofreading as the completely final stage of an edit, where ideally there should be fewer than 200 errors caught in that stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, go ahead, Tanya.
No, I just wanted to say it's always interesting to hear how other people define these things, and it feels like there is a lot of overlap between line editing and copy editing, and there are a lot of people as well who call a line edit, or as you call it, a stylistic edit, a heavy copy edit, but that might not even equate to, you know, what one person calls a stylistic edit might not be the exact same thing as another person calls a heavy copy edit or a stylistic edit. We all approach these things so differently, and their standards are starting to happen, but they're not really across the whole industry.
Oh,
yeah.
Can I add something on copy editing and line editing? There's definitely a tendency, I'm based in the UK, and here there's definitely a tendency to use copy editing much more, and line editing seen as something else on the other side of the Atlantic sometimes. I
was going to address a similar in that blurring between these two services, because often when I'm doing a stylistic edit, I'm also copy editing. But for me, and I do tell my clients, like, yes, I'll deal with copy editing mistakes, but because we're still shaping the sentences and the paragraphs, and I'm basically just making suggestions for them to go in and either accept or reject as they see fit, they're still working fairly heavily with the manuscript. So even if I deal with, you know, all of the copy editing issues, more are going to crop up, because sometimes they're going to have to go in and rewrite a sentence, and they're not paying attention to the same things that I would pay attention to as an editor. So even though I do say, yes, I'll deal with copy editing stuff, but also you're still probably going to want to get a copy edit after this, because we don't know what's cropped up. And if the client has a lot of experience, then maybe they can skip straight to proofing because they're pretty good at keeping it clean. But for novice writers, I do definitely suggest getting a copy edit after a stylistic edit. So that's like a brief overview of the sort of main types of editing and coaching stuff that you'll experience as a writer. What's one thing you think writers should look for when they're trying to find an editor to work with, and why should they look for that thing?
There's many things you should pick, but one really important thing, especially for fiction, is having a kind of good vibe with the editor that you pick. So when you communicate with them, are you communicating by email or by Zoom? Do you feel comfortable in the interaction with them? And do you feel, I don't know, excited, motivated? Are there some kind of creative sparks flying? That doesn't happen every time, and it doesn't have to happen every time. But I do think for fiction, things tend to go a lot more smoothly, and it's a much more fun experience when you have that kind of nice vibe with an editor. So
I absolutely agree. Getting the right vibe is very important. I also think that you should look for somebody who is interested in some of the topics that you're writing about. So, you know, if you know that, even beyond genre, if you know that you've written something that has a lot of romance in it, then look for an editor who has expressed interest in romance. Or if you've written something with a particular type of character, I mean, if you've got a queer character in there, you want somebody who's going to be okay and supportive with that lifestyle and isn't going to be making crappy comments at you, right? For any kind of thing like that, you want to sort of look at what do they support, and what kind of things do they talk about on their website, on their social media, all those places, and how well do those align with your values and what you've written about. Davy, what do you think?
Yeah, so my original answer to this question was going to be pretty much exactly what Andy said. So to add on to vibes and values, I think it's really important to sort of look for an editor who has that they're willing to share their personality publicly. Because sometimes you'll come across someone who's offering editing services, but they don't talk about themselves as a person. They just say, this is what I do, and that's it. And that's not very useful to a writer. You want to know that you're dealing with like a real person, has like a full life with interests, and as Genevieve said, with their own values. So I think it's important to see if they have a personality and if they're willing to share that with people, because chances are, if you're working closely with an editor, that personality is going to come through, and you want to know that you have like some shared interest with them, just as Genevieve and Andy said before.
I love that. That's such a good answer. We've got vibes, values, and visibility. This is what we're going for. I don't know if you're going to be able to find another V in there, Tanya.
No, probably
No
not.
pressure.
But, I think so. A counterpoint to all that is, if that's what you want, right? A lot of people want to have more of a business relationship with an editor, and that is a perfectly valid, there's V, perfectly valid approach too, to just have somebody that you send it off to, they give it back to you, and there's minimal interaction. That's not the kind of editor that I am, but there are a lot of editors out there like that. And it's okay if these approaches or these suggestions that we mentioned, if they don't resonate with you, that's fine. There are editors out there for you too. The point that I was going to bring up in addition to all this as well was whether they work on the types of books that you're writing, which is especially important for people who are working on the story side of things, that they understand the kind of story that you're working towards, that you're going for, so that they can help you deliver that story and don't try and make it into something else. But it's also important on the prose side of things for anything where there's a specialized kind of form, like and expectations around that kind of form, like poetry or comics or interactive fiction, things like that.
That's a great point. Sometimes, I mean, often on social media, but I guess Goodreads is social media too. If you find editors there, then you can see what kind of books they like to read. And so sometimes, you know, there's certain types of books that we work on. You know, we've all said we work on speculative fiction, but that breaks down into so many other subgenres. And, you know, so you can look through kind of what books resonate with them and how similar does that hit with what you've written, because sometimes I like to read certain stories and I don't necessarily advertise that I would also edit them. And maybe that's because I don't really want to edit them, but maybe it's just because that's not where my focus is at the moment. So there's no harm in being like, she's read a book and loved a book that I think is a good comp title for mine, so let me go and ask. That's also a perfectly valid way to check out if you're gonna vibe with your editor.
Yeah. It's also totally okay if you find an editor you really vibe with and they don't do the type of thing that
Yeah.
you want to ask, and they might be able to refer you to somebody who has a similar vibe who works on that type of content. I know we all know a lot of other editors who are happy to recommend people who might be a better fit.
Absolutely. And sometimes, you know, if you're really on the same page, you'll make an exception and be like, you know what, I don't usually edit this kind of work, but I'm really interested in your story and I really like your approach and all the discussions we've had, and I'm going to give it a shot. When writers chat with an editor about working together, what do you think it's important for them to pay attention to? Davy, why don't you start us off?
So if you're chatting with an editor, chances are you've got a sample edit done. And when you get one of those done from an editor, one of the jokes that I like to make is that you can send an excerpt to 4 editors and you'll get 5 different sample edits back. So I think it's really important when you're speaking with an editor is to assess how they explain their changes. And are they willing to explain their changes? Because sometimes an editor will make a change, but they won't explain it because for them, it's a change that they've made dozens of times. So I think it's important to, even if you know the answer yourself, ask them to explain a change and see how they perceive it. Can they explain it to you in simple terms? Does their logic make sense to you? Because if you're going to be working with an editor, there's going to be many changes, and chances are you're not going to agree with all of them. So you need to trust what the editor says to you.
That's an excellent answer. I will have a slight counter there, because that applies for, you know, stylistic and copy editing and even proofreading, but not as well on the developmental side, because how can I do a sample for a developmental edit if the whole purpose is to read your whole story and evaluate how well you're hitting all of the beats that you need to hit. So while, you know, while that is very valid, it depends on what sort of edit you are asking about. At the developmental level, actually, since Tanya and Andy both spoke about developmental editing earlier, do either of you have suggestions about answered this question specifically from a developmental lens? Andy?
Yeah, I mean, with developmental editing, the short answer is you can't do a sample because you need to read the whole manuscript. Developmental editing is holistic, but you can still ask. For instance, I have a service I call Fast Feedback, where I'll give basically critique feedback on a short sample, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 words or something like that. And you can still get a lot out of that. You can look at how the editor's explaining or not explaining points in a way that you like. You can get a sense of the editor's tone as well, how they're interacting in the feedback. And you can also learn a lot from a small sample, especially if you're a new author. So yeah, the short answer is you can't really do a sample for a developmental edit, but do look at what other services they're offering. And I always recommend, because a full developmental edit or even a critique is hundreds or several thousands of dollars even, it's a lot of money. So I highly recommend working with maybe 1 or maybe 2 or 3 editors on smaller samples first, and that could be a chapter critique or it could be a short story. So that's my thoughts.
Tanya?
Yeah, I agree that there are ways of doing a workaround for a sample for a developmental edit. It isn't representative of the entire process or what you'll actually get. And if somebody asks for a sample developmental edit, I'll do one with that caveat saying, you know, the feedback that I give you here might not actually be valid. It's just giving you an example of the type of feedback that I would give, but it could be completely wrong in the context of your whole story. But the main thing, the thing that I think is really important during evaluating a developmental editor or a writing coach or something like that is the conversations that you have with them, the types of questions that they ask you, and how much they take into consideration your goals for your story. If they're just going to come into your story and say, well, I know what this kind of story is supposed to be, but not listen to what you want it to be, that to me, that's a little bit of a red flag. So seeing what questions they ask, how well they listen to your answers, if they have follow-up questions, how they answer your questions as well about their process and how that all works. And if you're doing an edit, how well, or a sample edit, how well those your goals are reflected in the way that they actually do that sample.
Right. So you would have already asked those questions in advance of doing the
Oh
sample?
yeah, absolutely. I want to understand the way that how they perceive their story and what their goals are, and whether they actually are looking for the kind of edit that they say they're looking for. Because again, the terminology is different all over the place. So investigating, what do you actually want help with, and how do my services align with that? And so figuring that out before I do a sample makes more sense.
I think I'm kind of similar. I go through a similar process of figuring out, okay, what exactly is it that you want, and is it something that I offer? And I do try to explain, like, these are my services and the terms that I use. So figuring out where an author falls into that. Although I don't do my intake questionnaire is quite extensive, so I don't typically do that until I'm fairly certain that we're going to work together, because I don't want to send somebody like a 3-page questionnaire and then they don't end up signing on with me. So I usually do that a little bit later in the process. But I do maybe kind of a medium between you and Andy, in terms of, like, I explain that I can't do a sample, but because I ask for a sample of their writing so I can evaluate where it's at, and if what they're asking for seems to align with what they need, I will sort of do a little write-up saying, well, based on this, 1 chapter or 2 chapters, however much I've read, these are some of the big picture issues that I'm seeing crop up, and that will be things that need to be addressed. So I think I'm kind of in between the two of you.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of how we like our intake process and how it's different. Yeah, I don't jump right away into like the 3 pages of questions. It's more like, here are these 4 or 5 questions to start with, and then at that point, like, I basically want to know a little bit more about your project. And if I'm not a good fit, then we don't waste your time on these longer set of questions. But if I am, there's all this. And this kind of goes back to what you were saying, Andy, about like preference for communication as well. There are a lot of people who, like, if you prefer to have these kind of discussions over a video chat, there are some editors who will do that, and there's some who won't. And if that's important to you as a writer, then that's a good time to figure that out, whether editors will communicate in that way.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Editing is a labor-intensive process that requires a lot of specialized skills. Because of that, it can come with a pretty hefty price tag, as was already mentioned. So what do you suggest for authors who have a limited budget? And do you offer any of these options? I'm going to start with Davy again, because he hasn't spoken in a little while.
Okay. So my answer is going to be from the copy editing perspective mostly, which is where saving your editor time really comes in handy. So a lot of copy editors, they charge by the hour. So as an author, you are incentivized to reduce how much time your editor is going to spend on your manuscript. So one really easy way of doing that is consistency in the style choices that you make. So a really simple example of that is how you style ellipses. There are many different ways you can do it. And if you're inconsistent with it, it's really difficult for your editor to change it in a one fell swoop, because often an editor will use like find and replace, or like a couple different programs that can mechanically alter some of your style choices. But if you're really inconsistent in how you approach a style choice, that means every time an editor comes across it in your manuscript, they'll have to pause and check to make sure that it's correct. And every time an editor stops, it's kind of like a car that you're pumping the brakes on. And then you have to accelerate back up to speed again and again and again. And that's a huge time sink. So something as simple as being consistent in how you style dashes, ellipses, interruptions in speech, in prose. That, if you're consistent, that will possibly save you 2 to 3 hours, and that can be a pretty big savings.
Absolutely. That's definitely great advice, because we all come across that all the time, and it's just like, oh my goodness, wait, which convention are we using again? And you do have to jump back and forth if you aren't able to do it in one fell swoop, as well as just general formatting. Andy, do you have any suggestions?
So one thing that springs to mind, especially with new authors, is that it's tricky because new authors are kind of a group of people that will possibly benefit the most from developmental editing. But developmental editing is also quite an expensive service. And so because of that, what I try to do is make sure that I have services at different price points. So I have them at 3 different price points, ranging from like a manuscript critique to a developmental edit, which includes 2 redos, more comments, etc., and so on. So that's one thing that you can do. Another thing that I've already mentioned is that I do think new authors can get a lot out of coaching either on samples or short stories. So that's a lower price offering that you can also consider. And then so if you're offering kind of one-to-one services, then that's tricky, because if you introduce a discount, then you're discounting like your time, your labor time on that. But it's much easier to give discounts if you're doing workshops, kind of one-to-many things, or courses and things like that. So whenever I run workshops, well, first of all, it's a lot cheaper for a single author to attend than to book a one-to-one coaching session or something with me. So that's one thing you can do. And I like to do like webinars as well for free, like once every couple of months, where authors can ask questions. So I can link to that as well at the end. So yeah, come along to a Q&A if you want to find out more.
That's a great one, because it's a lot of editors offer those sorts of things, or they speak at events where you have an opportunity to ask them the things that are bothering you. And I don't think people acknowledge how rich of a resource that is often enough. So that is an excellent suggestion. Tanya, what about you?
I'm similar to Andy in that I offer tiers of services at different price points. I won't get up on my soapbox here about how about publishing and needing to bring in a more diversity of authors from different backgrounds. I feel strongly about making it more accessible, making editing services more accessible, but also we all need to keep a roof over our heads and food in our mouths and our bellies. So one way to work around that is to reduce the cost by, like Davy was saying, reduce the amount of time that the editor is spending on it. So if you take on more of the workload as a writer, then the editor is doing less. So like a developmental edit, if I'm not putting the comments in the manuscript, you have to then take the critique and understand like and try to understand and determine what are the specifics that align with that generality of a critique. Andy, you also mentioned coaching. One of the things that I do is revision coaching, which is basically, here's how you figure out how to apply all of the stuff that I would do for you in developmental editing and gain perspective on your manuscript, and I'll kind of hold your hand through the process. So that's at a different price point than a critique even. But that's still, a few $100s, which not everybody can afford. So one of the things that I just did was I launched a course which allows people to do this at their own pace. And that's much less money than coaching, than a developmental edit, so that people can basically do the developmental editing on their own. And you don't have somebody giving you their perspective on your entire manuscript, but it gives you a lot of those same, it walks you through a lot of those same tools and steps that we would take as developmental editors. And I also offer scholarships for that as well.
Yeah. And as a person who has taken that course, which is called the DIY Developmental Edit, I can say that it is an excellent option.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. For me, I agree with everything everybody said. And I have a very similar approach to everybody else here in that I do offer, different levels of service to accommodate. And while I do offer one-on-one coaching, majority of my coaching is in a group setting, which is significantly cheaper than it is one-on-one. But another way, even if you're like, ooh, well, I can't even afford to take, the course, that is, because we're all at different places. And sometimes these are things you do have to save up for, right? Life is expensive. So if you're even struggling to meet these lower price points, again, do the work on your own and find, most editors that I know have a space on their website that recommends craft books. So go and check out those editors who you've been vibing with and who you're like, yes, I like what they're saying. And if I could work with them, I would be the happiest person in the world. Check out their websites, find that resources page, and read the books they're suggesting so that you can then understand some of the things that they're going to be applying and hopefully apply that yourself. And, you know, if you're very new at it, maybe you won't be expert in that application, but the attempt was there, and that will give your editor that foundation to work off of, which will make their job easier. So when all else fails, go and read the craft books and like take them out from the library. You don't even have to buy them. Yeah, that's my suggestion.
Yeah. I don't think we touched upon line editing and how you can save on that as well, which
yes,
yeah,
that's a good point.
yeah, the one option for that is getting, I think this is similar to what you were saying, Andy, with coaching. Like one of the types of coaching that I offer is workshopping, which is basically, as Genevieve defined it, going back and forth on a shorter piece and like really pushing your skills further. It's more focused on skill building than it is necessarily on a larger piece. And you can learn a lot about your writing from that and your habits and the way that you express yourself and how your writing reflects the story, all the types of things that come up in line editing, stylistic editing, or whatever you want to call it. And that is a fraction of the cost of having a short story or a longer short story, I should say, or a full novel line edited. Yeah,
I 100% agree. And I can say that that was the option that I went with when working on my book. It's a novel in stories. So I had one full story edited, the line edit done. And then because there's multiple points of view, I had the first page of 2 of the other viewpoints done so that I could get a sense of how I was handling the voice of different characters. And that was significantly cheaper because it was only a very small fraction of the book. And then I could take all of that knowledge that I had gotten and see, and it's not just like broad sense knowledge, it's very specifically, these are your writer tics, because we cannot see our own writer tics. So having somebody point it out and say, hey, you keep doing this kind of thing. And then you're like, okay, keep that in mind as I go through and take out those things that I don't realize I'm doing. So yeah, that is an excellent advice. That is excellent advice for line editing. All right. What's one thing you would like to share about the editing process itself? So if you've only ever been an editor, you can give it from that point of view. But if you've also been edited, you're welcome to give it from a writer's point of view. Tanya?
Editing and any kind of feedback on your work is basically a process of getting advice and suggestions. And not in all situations, but most situations, you have control over your work. You have the final say. If you don't agree with a suggestion, don't take it on. But also consider, if you're not taking one specific piece of advice, how it impacts all of the other advice that you're taking and how it all fits together. But it's your final choice. You know, you're not going to agree with everything that an editor is going to suggest.
Davy?
All right, I'll answer this from the perspective of a writer. So, as we all know, writing is very emotional. You get very attached to what you've written, and you get this image in your head of what it's supposed to be like. And generally speaking, that falls apart upon first contact with an editor. And my advice, really, about being edited is to understand that it's the editor's job to, first of all, understand your vision and make sure that you are achieving that as best as you can with what you've written. So it's not an editor's job to discourage you. It's not an editor's job to destroy what you've written. It's their goal to help you make it the best that it can be. And so sometimes that involves saying goodbye to certain parts of your manuscript that really aren't helping you with what you've tried to write. And that can be really difficult. And generally, my advice after a heavy edit is to read the feedback, look at the changes, and then leave it be for about a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then come back to it. Give yourself time to, I don't necessarily want to say grieve the edit, but you need to get accustomed to a new way of looking at your manuscript, because it can be rather painful sometimes to be edited.
Yes, that is very,
Yeah.
very true. And for some people, you need a couple days. Other people need a couple weeks, and sometimes it's going to take a couple months. When I was edited, it took me a couple months before I was in the right headspace to really, and it was mostly very positive feedback too. It wasn't that it was bad and it was like, oh, my novel is terrible. It just took me a long time to adjust because we still have all of life to deal with. So give yourself the space you need to take that in. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard sometimes to realize that what you have in your head isn't exactly what you put on the page.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to process that on its own, let alone everything else that you're going to get feedback on is challenging. Yeah, it's a really good point, Davy.
Yes. Andy?
I'll answer partly from a writer perspective, partly from an editor perspective. One important point is that editors need editing as well. I think that for developmental editing, I always make a comparison with like counseling or psychotherapy. You don't have that much awareness of like, because you're so close to like with counseling yourself, but here your text, you often don't have that much awareness of what's working and what's not. And even when you're experienced and you've got like, I don't know, critique feedback already, you might know, oh, characterization or character development's a weak point for me. But the beauty of that edit is that they'll give you such really specific suggestions, and they'll really home in on precise problems that link to that, rather than just saying, oh, I thought the manuscript was weak on character development. So that's for developmental editing. And for line and copy editing, again, it's about being too close to the text. I have a problem with homophones in my writing, for example. So that's a particular issue for me. That's something I'm trained to watch out for as an editor, but the issues that I have in my writing will be different to somebody else's. And I think that's why TradPub has this kind of, they have a copy editing stage and then a separate proofing stage, which is really a quality assurance check. So yeah, editors need editing as well. And it's daunting. Like I really like, especially because it's an unregulated market. You don't know, anyone can like set up their shingle and call themselves an editor. So go slow, do your research. Yeah, take your time, and yeah, there's no reason to rush at all really with any of this. That's what I'd say. And that's what I did as well when I hired an editor. So
Awesome. I think for me, also same from both a writing and an editing perspective. It's very quiet. So like, don't expect, unless this is something you've discussed, because some people need constant updates. And if you are that kind of person, make sure you tell your editor that, because otherwise there's a good chance that they're going to take your book and then they're going to be like, I'm just over here working. And they might get so absorbed in that they forget to tell you things are going great, right? So I know like when I was being edited, I've worked with multiple different editors at multiple different stages, and sometimes I would maybe get one update, sometimes I wouldn't get any updates. It was just, this is the deadline, and if I haven't gotten it back by then, I should be concerned, but otherwise I kind of put it out of my head. But sometimes I would get several updates. It really depended on who I was working with. And for me, it was fine, because I was perfectly content to say, take this and you think about it so I don't have to, and like literally put it out of my head while it was being edited so I could go and do other things. But some people are, especially if you're a very new author and you're anxious about it, so you might want to say, you know, I'm very anxious about this, and could you please give me, you know, weekly updates, or bi-weekly updates. It really depends on how long they're going to have your novel with them. And I would suggest not asking for daily. That's a big ask, but like weekly is a fairly reasonable, you know, just a quick email saying, yes, the edit's going well, nothing to worry about over here. Otherwise, really the only time you should expect to hear from your editor is if they need to ask you a question so that they can make the appropriate choices to ensure that the edit that they're giving you is in line with your vision and what you're trying to achieve. So yeah, expect it to be a little quiet unless you ask otherwise.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even as somebody who is not a new writer, I'm like, the entire time anybody has any of my work. So yeah, it's not just advice for newer writers. Yeah.
Yes, it's really about knowing yourself and what you need, and
Mhm.
if you need the reassurance, or if you're like, it's all good, it's all good. Don't tell me until the day that we agreed on, because I don't have space for it in my brain right now. Okay, so that's all we've got for you, except that now we have the Q&A, and so this is the perfect opportunity to ask us all of your most pressing questions. Anybody got pressing questions? Doesn't look like it. I guess we did a really good job explaining everything.
Well, it's a good thing we don't have too many questions, because I think we have 3 minutes left anyways.
Yeah.
Oh. Oh,
How do you maintain such awesomeness? Oh, that's a tricky question. Practice? I'm gonna say practice. Kind of like writing. You got to keep working at it. It's the only way.
What Genevieve said.
Well, if there's no questions now, I mean, I guess that's all good. I'm sure I certainly will be on the Discord a little bit over the weekend, and I'm sure some of the others will as well. So if you think of something later that you want to ask us, feel free to put that in the Discord, and we will try to answer it there. We also have a resource sheet that links to each of our websites and some of the stuff that we mentioned during the chat, which we'll put in the Discord as well. I don't think I've ever had so few questions at one of these.
Thanks everyone for coming.
yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
And hop on the Discord later if you have any questions at all.
Yeah, absolutely. See you there.
Bye.
Bye.
See you, everyone.